Welcome back, and as always, welcome aboard to another episode of Building History. It has been a long time coming, and my hope for this new year is that I am able to release these episodes on a more frequent basis. However, I'm already not off to a good start. As always, though, thank you so much for joining me. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel, follow me on Instagram and Facebook, and leave a comment down below. Or you can email the show at buildinghistorymodels@gmail.com. Thank you for your continued support. It is very much appreciated. Now, on today's episode, we're building the Revell A-6E Intruder while discussing the history of this, the world's first true all-weather attack aircraft. And here, joining me today is Mrs. Building History, my lovely wife, Rebecca. Welcome to the show. Take it away.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, sweetie. I am, of course, Mrs. Building History, and yes, my name is Rebecca. Picture this. The U.S. Navy, in all of its mighty wisdom, is looking to replace the A-1 Skyraider. Why, you ask? Well, mainly because the A-1 was fair weather limited during the Korean War. Why would they make an airplane that could only fly in sunny skies? That seems absolutely ridiculous. Anyway, back to the Navy, and in 1955, they released their preliminary requirements, otherwise known as their list of demands, for an all-weather carrier-based attack craft. In October 1956, they released the operational requirements, followed by a full request for all proposals for the aircraft in February of 1957. Now, these list of demands called specifically for a, quote, close air support attack bomber capable of hitting the enemy at any time, unquote. Which sounds absolutely awesome and badass and should have been what they did in the first place. Following the call for proposals, 8 different companies stepped up to the plate and submitted 11 different design options to the Navy for consideration. And on January 2nd of 1958, Grumman was awarded the contract. Grumman had already designed the majority of Navy carrier-based planes prior to this point. Grumman came up with a design called the G-128. It was later designated the A2F-1. The Navy gave it that mouthful. The A2F-1 was extremely cutting edge for the early 1960s. Specifically, it was so cutting edge, its sophisticated avionics, which made use of multiple computers, it was so fancy that the design, experience, the advanced work with the computers, well, it was taken into consideration when NASA ultimately chose Grumman as its contractor to build the lunar lander. Designed from the get-go as a joint Navy and Marine Corps aircraft, the Marines had a performance requirement of short takeoff and landing, otherwise known as STOL. So the original 6 airplanes that were designed by Grumman, they were designed with tilting tailpipes to meet this STOL goal. Did you see what I did there? Which tilting tailpipes means absolutely nothing to me, but you aircraft aficionados, you're picking up what I'm putting down. But the performance benefits of that tilting tailpipe function were deemed pretty much, they were worthless. And the tailpipes from then on were just fixed with a 7-degree down angle. The A2F-1 prototype became airborne on April 19th, 1960. And in the fall of 1962, the A2F-1, get your pen and paper ready, here we go, its name was changed yet again under the DoD designation system, gave us what we now know it as today as an A6, which ended the traditional naval designation system it had up until that point. In February of 1963, the A6 was introduced to service with VA-75. The Sunday Punchers were the first operational A6 squadron. They also had the distinction of being the very last operational intruder squadron when the A6 was retired in 1997. VA-75 took the Intruder to combat 2 years later in 1965 on board the USS Independence. Deploying to the Gulf of Tonkin, the Sunday Punchers dropped over 2 million pounds of ordnance over Vietnam. Our favorite squadron returned to Vietnam a year later in 1968. Only this time, they were on board the USS Kitty Hawk. Once again, the VA-75 was setting records for the most missions and combat hours flown by an A6 squadron, dropped over 13 million pounds of ordnance, because 12 just wasn't enough. In the dead of night, on October 30th, 1967, Lieutenant Commander Charles Hunter and Lieutenant Lyle Bull launched in a single ship off the USS Constellation and proceeded to conduct a textbook attack on the Red River Ferry docks near downtown Hanoi. They were flying an A-6A from Squadron VA-196 loaded with 13 Mark 83s, which are 1,000-pound snake eye bombs. And I have no idea what that is, but it sounds awesome. Having just been removed from the prohibited list, was now considered an important yet untouchable target. Several attempts had been previously made at destroying the docks, but all had failed miserably, largely due to the immense number of intense defenses in the area, which, if you ask Lieutenant Bull, and somebody did, included 20 SA-2 SAMs, or as we common folk call them, surface-to-air missile sites, and exactly 597 AAA guns, or anti-aircraft artillery guns. I'm pretty sure those shoot planes down, so those are never a good thing. The XO Bob Blackwood thought that a single intruder going in at very low altitude at night could hit the target. He was quoted as saying, "This is the mission the intruder was made for." So here we are. Our pilot and BN, Hunter and Bull, launched and flew towards Hanoi at 500 feet above the ground. Lieutenant Bull later recalled after the mission that, quote, "Intelligence had reported that the SA-2s couldn't track below 1,500 feet. We were disturbed to see that their assessment was incorrect." SAM activity started 18 miles out and got sporty in a hurry. One missile ended up following them below 500 feet. Hunter, our glorious pilot, started a high G barrel roll to throw it off. And now, upside down, they ended up counting at least 5 missiles in the air. So they rolled upright and descended their intruder to 100 feet, all while doing more than 450 knots, or 517 miles an hour. Once the target appeared on radar, They popped up to an altitude of 200 feet to release the payload, striking the target hard. Lieutenant Commander Hunter, our amazing pilot, immediately turned east, recovering aboard after an intense and grueling 1.9-hour flight. Now, if this story of the strike sounds somewhat vaguely familiar, that's because it became the basis for a book and eventually turned movie called, you guessed it, The Flight of the Intruder.
Fighter pukes make movies. Bomber pilots make history.
Both aviators received the Navy Cross for their mission against the docks that October night. They would be the first of 5 A-6 crews, though, to receive that honor. Both eventually went on to achieve the rank of Rear Admiral. Described by most as ugly, lethal, and effective, the Intruder's ungainly look stemmed from its design. The fuselage was designed around its immense and for the time highly advanced navigation and radar equipment, which was housed in the nose of the aircraft. This led to a very wide, nose, and instead of having the pilot and the bombardier sit in tandem, the engineers decided to take advantage of that width and have them positioned, in fact, side by side, with the bombardier sitting just slightly lower and slightly behind the pilot to aid in visibility to that side. This created, unintentionally, but in the best of ways, a camaraderie between the pilot and the bombardier that was unmatched by other aircraft crews. Without a doubt, the most effective system of the A-6 was the pilot and bombardier navigator team. It took both working in absolute synchronicity. I don't think that's a word. It took both working in absolute synchronicity to make the Intruder function at peak efficiency. In bad weather, night, terrain, following it was an absolute act of total and complete trust. The BN display was a map from an overhead view, while the pilot's was a silhouette of 7 slices of terrain at ascending distances, giving a synthetic horizontal view of the same terrain. Francesco Cerici, call sign Paco, described it as you look out for one another in every way possible and totally trust what the other said and did. He went on to describe it in much greater detail, stating, "The boot was essentially a shroud with a padded hole where the BN would stick his face. It shielded the cockpit from the light of the radar so it wouldn't blind the pilot during night flying. But when using it, the BN couldn't see what was going on outside in the real world. So we would be flying through steep ravines at 7 miles a minute, at night, as low as we dared. I would be glancing nervously at the granite cliff wall that I could barely make out, and the BN, here he was, stuck with his head down, arms spinning dials and switches like some dark wizard, immersed in his virtual world of radar returns, completely oblivious to the violent yanking and banking as we jinked through the low-level route." If the pilot and the BN were the heart and soul of the Intruder, then the avionics were for sure the brain. The digital, integrated attack and navigation equipment, also abbreviated as DIAN, was integrated with all the aircraft systems that would give the pilot and the BN their respective views and ultimately allowed the aircraft to perform in the way that it did. The penultimate version of the A-6 was the A-6E variant. The same variant is the subject of this scale model. In 1979, the A-6E debuted with a targeting, recognition, and attack multi-sensor, lovingly known as TRAM. It is conspicuously housed in a turret under the nose ahead of the nose landing gear. And the TRAM included an infrared laser receiver and a self-designating laser designator and a designator receiver. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I read that right. Anyway, this gave the already lethal and capable Intruder even more, allowing it to self-designate laser-guided munitions. VA-35, the Black Panthers, the squadron, represented by this model, received their first A-6E Intruder in September of 1965. And between 1966 and January of 1973, VA-35 saw 4 deployments, including participating in the last airstrike in South Vietnam against North Vietnamese forces near the DMZ. In August of 1990, the Black Panthers deployed on a Mediterranean cruise that was to be interrupted by Desert Storm and Desert Shield. Launching from the USS Saratoga, VA-35 was the first Navy squadron to drop bombs on Iraqi targets. It was also the first to use night vision devices, NVDs, in combat. Culminating in over 300 combat hours while using NVDs, they flew nearly 400 sorties, all over 5 hours, and dropped over 1.7 million pounds of ordnance. Later in 1994, VA-35 deployed on board the USS Saratoga, supporting UN peacekeepers in Bosnia. This deployment turned out to be the USS Saratoga's last cruise, sad, before her decommissioning, as well as the last cruise for the Black Panthers, who were disestablished on January 31st, 1995, after 60 years of continuous service. After 30 years of service, the Intruder was retired from active duty from the U.S. Marine Corps on April 28, 1993. The Navy continued flying their Intruders for another few years until, sadly, fully retiring the beloved aircraft on February 28, 1997. The A-6 Intruder, sometimes affectionately, sometimes not so, called the Flying Drumstick or the Iron Tadpole, was an undeniably effective weapons delivery platform, capable of carrying a payload of 15,000 pounds, which, if you're keeping up with your history, know that the famous B-17 Flying Fortress of World War II only had a payload of 4,000 pounds. During the Vietnam War, the A-6 Intruder was second only to the B-52 Stratofortress in the amount of ordnance that it was able to carry, and it did this all while being able to launch off of a carrier deck in 300 feet, fly at treetop level, or sometimes below, and attack the enemy in the dead of night in the worst of weather. An impressively capable machine that earned the respect and admiration of the aviators who flew her, and most assuredly has cemented its place in aviation history. It was even an excellent gas station for the greatest naval fighter of all time. Thank you so much for joining us as we explored, albeit briefly, although I wouldn't call that brief, this amazing aircraft. Please tune in next time for the next episode of Building History. In the meantime, please give this video a like and leave a comment below, and consider subscribing to the channel. You can reach us here anytime at buildinghistorymodels@gmail.com or follow the builds in real time on Instagram, or find our Facebook page. Links to all this will be in the description below. Thank you once again for joining us. Until next time, toodaloo!